On March 14, 1881, a single line appeared in the admission log of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. The entry, written in the careful script of head nurse Dorothy Ashford, read simply, "Abigail Brennan, age 9 years, complete mutism of unknown origin, admitted under care of Dr. Edmund Hartley." What that sterile notation did not capture was the quiet horror that had begun unfolding in the Brennan household 3 weeks prior, a horror that would eventually draw the attention of physicians, priests, and men of power who wished desperately that certain truths remain buried. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories dropping tomorrow. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now let's continue with the story. The Brennan family lived in a narrow brick house on Arch Street, in a neighborhood where clerks and shopkeepers raised their children within earshot of the docks and the constant rumble of commerce. Samuel Brennan worked at the Philadelphia Customs House, a position that paid modestly but carried a certain respectability. His wife, Catherine, supplemented their income by giving piano lessons to the daughters of families slightly more prosperous than their own. They had 2 children, Abigail, who at 9 years old showed promise in her studies, and her younger brother James, age 6, who followed her everywhere with the devotion of a shadow. The fever came suddenly in late February. Abigail woke one morning complaining of chills, and by evening her temperature had climbed so high that Catherine kept wet cloths on her forehead through the night, whispering prayers that her daughter would survive until dawn. Dr. Hartley, summoned at great expense, examined the girl thoroughly and prescribed rest, cold baths, and careful monitoring. The fever broke after 4 days, and Abigail opened her eyes with apparent recognition of her surroundings. Catherine wept with relief. But something had changed. Abigail would not speak. She moved through the house like a ghost, responding to questions with nods or shakes of her head, attending to small tasks with mechanical precision. She would sit at the dinner table and eat in absolute silence. She would dress herself, care for James when asked, complete her schoolwork without complaint. But no sound passed her lips. Not a word, not a cry, not even a whisper. Samuel insisted it was temporary, a lingering effect of the fever that would resolve itself with time. Catherine was less certain. She watched her daughter's face for signs of distress or confusion, and found neither. Abigail seemed perfectly aware, perfectly capable. She simply would not speak. Dr. Hartley examined her again, peering down her throat, testing her hearing, asking her to cough or hum. Her vocal cords appeared undamaged. There was no swelling, no obstruction, no physical reason for her silence. It was the hospital nurse who first witnessed what happened after dark, 3 nights after Abigail's admission. Helen Kovach had been making her rounds through the children's ward when she heard a voice speaking with strange, measured cadence. The words were incomprehensible to her, flowing together in a language she did not recognize. She followed the sound to Abigail's bed and found the girl sitting upright, eyes open but vacant, staring at nothing while Latin phrases poured from her mouth in perfect, ancient pronunciation. The time was exactly 2:47 in the morning. Helen Kovach had worked as a night nurse for 12 years, long enough to witness most variations of human suffering and strangeness. She had seen patients cry out in delirium, had heard fevered confessions and opium dreams spoken aloud in the small hours. But this was different. The child's voice carried an unnatural clarity, each syllable pronounced with precision that suggested full consciousness. Yet her eyes remained fixed on some invisible point beyond the hospital walls. The nurse stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes, listening as Abigail spoke without pause or breath, the Latin flowing in an unbroken stream. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the girl fell silent. She lay back down, closed her eyes, and appeared to sink into normal sleep. Helen approached the bed cautiously and checked the child's pulse. Steady and strong. She noted the episode in her log with shaking hands, uncertain how to describe what she had witnessed. The following night, Helen arrived for her shift with a mixture of dread and curiosity. She positioned herself near Abigail's bed as the clock ticked toward the small hours. At precisely 2:47, the girl sat up. Her eyes opened, but showed no awareness. The Latin began again, but this time, Helen noticed something that made her stomach clench with fear. She recognized a name: Thomas Pritchard. Thomas Pritchard worked as an orderly in the hospital, a quiet man of 43 who had been employed there for over a decade. Helen knew him by sight, had exchanged pleasantries with him countless times. Now she heard his name embedded in the girl's incomprehensible speech, repeated several times with what sounded like geographic directions. The East Corridor, the linen storage room, a specific time, which Helen calculated from the Latin numbers, 3:15 in the afternoon on the following day. She tried to convince herself it meant nothing. Latin was a language of medicine and prayer. Perhaps the child had overheard something, absorbed words without understanding them. But the specificity troubled her. After Abigail fell silent and returned to sleep, Helen found Thomas Pritchard taking his break in the staff room and studied his face carefully. He looked tired, but otherwise unremarkable. She said nothing about what she had heard. The next afternoon, Helen was preparing to leave after her shift when she heard shouting from the east wing. She rushed toward the commotion and found a crowd gathering near the linen storage room. Thomas Pritchard lay on the floor, his face gray, one hand clutched to his chest. Dr. Hartley was already kneeling beside him, checking for a pulse. Helen looked at the clock mounted on the corridor wall. 3:17 in the afternoon. 2 minutes past the time Abigail had specified in her nocturnal Latin. Thomas Pritchard was pronounced dead at 3:24. Heart seizure, sudden and catastrophic. The staff spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy, about his widow and children, about how quickly death could arrive without warning. Helen Kovach said nothing about the prediction. She told herself it was coincidence, impossible correlation. But that night, when 2:47 approached, she stood beside Abigail's bed with a notebook in hand, ready to transcribe every word the child spoke. What she heard next would make her question everything she believed about the natural world and the boundaries between the living and the dead. Abigail began speaking of another death, another name, another impossibly specific prediction that would prove accurate down to the smallest detail. Dr. Edmund Hartley had built his reputation on rational observation and methodical diagnosis. At 41 years old, he had published 3 papers on speech disorders in children and served as the leading neurological consultant for Pennsylvania Hospital. He did not believe in supernatural phenomena, dismissed spiritualism as parlor trickery, and considered most claims of the unexplainable to be simple failures of proper investigation. This confidence began to crack on the morning Helen Kovach brought him her notebook. The nurse had filled 30 pages with transcribed Latin over the course of 6 nights. Her handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, but the content was clear enough. Abigail had spoken about 12 different people, providing details that ranged from mundane to deeply disturbing. Some entries described physical locations in Philadelphia with architectural precision. Others named individuals the child could not possibly have encountered. One passage described the hidden basement room of a merchant's house on Walnut Street, detailing items stored there that belonged to a missing girl who had disappeared 2 years prior. Hartley read through the transcriptions twice, his medical training warring with the evidence before him. He made inquiries. The merchant on Walnut Street was Jeremiah Caldwell, a respected dealer in imported textiles. The missing girl was named Rose Kimball, age 14, last seen in October of 1879. The police had investigated, but found nothing. Hartley considered going to the authorities with the information, then hesitated. What would he tell them? That a mute child spoke prophetic Latin in her sleep? He decided to observe for himself. That evening, he requested permission to stay overnight in the children's ward for research purposes. The hospital administrators agreed without question. He positioned himself in a chair beside Abigail's bed and waited. The girl slept peacefully through the early night hours, her breathing soft and regular. Hartley found himself growing drowsy, fighting to keep his eyes open. Then the clock in the corridor chimed the 1/4 past 2 in the morning. Abigail sat up, her eyes opened, pupils dilated wide, reflecting the dim lamplight with an unnatural shine. When she began to speak, Hartley felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The voice was undeniably hers, a child's pitch and timbre, but the cadence belonged to someone much older. The Latin flowed with grammatical structures he recognized from ancient texts, conjugations, and declensions that had fallen out of common usage centuries ago. He transcribed as quickly as his hand could move, capturing what he could. The content made his pulse quicken. Abigail was describing a crime, a murder. She named the victim, a warehouse clerk named Peter Donovan. She named the killer, Edmund Sutherland, a merchant who owned 3 successful shops in the city center. She described how it happened, the argument over gambling debts, the blow to the head with an iron weight, the body wrapped in canvas and buried in the foundation of a building under construction on Market Street. The date given was May of 1873, 8 years ago. When Abigail finished speaking and returned to sleep, Hartley sat in stunned silence. Edmund Sutherland was alive and prosperous. Peter Donovan's disappearance had been noted but never solved, his family eventually accepting that he had simply left the city to escape his creditors. If what the child said was true, a murderer walked free while his victim lay hidden beneath a building that now housed a printer's shop. Hartley knew he needed someone who could verify the Latin, someone who might understand what was happening. He thought of Father Michael O'Reilly, a Jesuit priest he had consulted on a previous case involving religious delusions. O'Reilly was a scholar, trained in classical languages, and possessed a mind that balanced faith with intellectual rigor. The next morning, Hartley sent a message requesting an urgent meeting. What he did not yet know was that bringing Father O'Reilly into this investigation would reveal something far more terrifying than a child who spoke impossible truths. It would reveal the price that came with every secret exposed. Father Michael O'Reilly arrived at Pennsylvania Hospital on a gray afternoon in late March, carrying a leather satchel containing his breviary, a Latin grammar, and several reference texts on medieval ecclesiastical language. He was a lean man of 52, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that suggested he had witnessed more of human nature than most priests cared to admit. Dr. Hartley met him in the hospital's small library and laid out the transcriptions without preamble. O'Reilly read in silence for nearly an hour. Occasionally, he would pause, consult one of his reference books, then return to the pages with a deepening frown. When he finally looked up, His expression had shifted from scholarly interest to something closer to alarm. The Latin was not merely correct, he explained. It was archaic in ways that troubled him deeply. The grammatical structures belonged to the late medieval period, perhaps earlier. The vocabulary included terms that had fallen out of use by the 15th century. No child could have learned this through casual exposure. No modern scholar would speak Latin this way unless deliberately recreating historical texts. More disturbing was the content itself. O'Reilly had translated the passage about Edmund Sutherland and Peter Donovan, and the details were sickeningly specific. The location of the burial, the method of killing, the motive. Either this was an elaborate hoax, or something impossible was occurring. Hartley assured him it was no hoax. He had witnessed the child speaking these words herself, had watched her vacant eyes and mechanical delivery. O'Reilly closed the notebook and made a decision. He would observe the next nocturnal episode personally. That night, the priest positioned himself opposite Dr. Hartley, both men flanking Abigail's bed like sentinels. The hospital ward was quiet, except for the occasional cough from another patient and the distant sound of carriages on the street outside. O'Reilly prayed silently, rosary beads moving through his fingers. Hartley checked his pocket watch repeatedly. The minutes crawled past midnight, through 1 in the morning, through 2. At 2:47, Abigail's eyes opened. O'Reilly began transcribing immediately, his hand steady despite the chill that crept up his spine. The child spoke for 18 minutes without pause. This time, she revealed secrets about people still living. She named a hospital board member, Jonathan Eldridge, and described his theft of charitable funds meant for the poor. She detailed how he falsified records, how he hid the money in accounts under his wife's maiden name, how he planned to use it to purchase property in New Jersey. The sums she mentioned were substantial, the dates precise. Then she spoke of another man, a judge named Horace Manning. Her Latin described his acceptance of bribes, his deliberate miscarriage of justice in 7 different cases, the specific amounts paid, and by whom. She named defendants who should have been convicted but walked free, victims who received no justice because Manning had been purchased. O'Reilly's hand trembled as he wrote. These were not historical crimes. These were current corruption, ongoing injustices. If true, they represented a rot at the heart of Philadelphia's legal and civic institutions. When Abigail fell silent and returned to sleep, O'Reilly and Hartley sat in the lamplight and stared at the pages covered in translation. The priest spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. This was not medical phenomenon. This was not natural. Something was using this child as a vessel, speaking truths that should remain hidden, exposing sins that powerful men had buried. He had seen cases of claimed possession before, had dismissed most as hysteria or fraud. But this was different. This knowledge could not have come from the child's own mind. Hartley asked the question both men were thinking. If they brought this information to the authorities, would anyone believe them? Would Eldridge and Manning even be investigated based on the nocturnal ravings of a mute child? And more troubling still, what would happen to Abigail if word spread about what she was revealing? Men with secrets to protect were dangerous men. O'Reilly had no answer. He only knew that before this night ended, they needed to understand the scope of what was happening. Because if the pattern Helen Kovach had noticed was real, if everyone whose secrets Abigail revealed ended up dead within weeks, then they were not just documenting impossible knowledge. They were witnessing a death sentence being pronounced, one terrible truth at a time. Margaret Dunlap had served as the hospital's social worker for 6 years, long enough to recognize when a mother was carrying a burden too heavy to speak aloud. Catherine Brennan visited her daughter every afternoon, sitting beside the bed with forced cheerfulness, reading from books and speaking in one-sided conversations that Abigail acknowledged only with nods. But Margaret noticed how Catherine's hands shook when she turned the pages, how her eyes darted to the windows, as if expecting something terrible to appear. On the 8th day of Abigail's hospitalization, Margaret invited Catherine to her small office for tea. The pleasantries lasted only moments before Catherine's composure cracked entirely. The words came out in a rush, 3 months of terror finally finding voice. The nocturnal speaking had not begun at the hospital. It started in their home on Arch Street in December, always at the same hour, always in that strange language Catherine could not understand. She had tried to wake Abigail during these episodes, but found her daughter unreachable, as if her body remained while her mind traveled elsewhere. The first incident happened on December 9th. Catherine had been jolted awake by the sound of speaking from her daughter's room. She rushed in to find Abigail sitting upright, eyes open but unseeing, Latin pouring from her lips. When the episode ended and Abigail returned to normal sleep, Catherine convinced herself it was merely a nightmare-given voice. But 2 nights later, she read in the Philadelphia Inquirer about a fire that had consumed a boarding house on Chestnut Street, killing 7 people. The date and location matched details she had heard in Abigail's Latin speech, words she had not understood, but somehow remembered. The second prediction came a week later. Abigail spoke of a child's body, a girl who had been missing for months. Catherine, despite her fear, managed to write down what sounded like street names and locations. She agonized for 2 days before sending an anonymous letter to the police, describing where they might search. The authorities found the body of 8-year-old Emma Yates exactly where Abigail had indicated, buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned warehouse on Delaware Avenue. The man who had taken her was arrested, tried, and hanged. Catherine never told anyone how she had known. After that, Catherine lived in constant dread of the 2:47 hour. She would lie awake, listening for her daughter's voice, wondering what new horror would be revealed. Samuel forbade her from discussing it with anyone. He insisted it would pass, that bringing attention to Abigail's condition would only result in their daughter being labeled insane or possessed. They would lose her to an asylum, he warned, or worse, to people who would exploit her strangeness for their own purposes. So Catherine remained silent while the predictions continued, while each revelation proved accurate, while her daughter remained voiceless by day and spoke impossibilities by night. Margaret listened to this confession with growing alarm. She asked Catherine why she had finally chosen to speak now, and the answer made her blood run cold. 3 days before Abigail's fever, the child had spoken about her own father. Catherine did not understand the Latin, but she heard Samuel's name repeated multiple times, heard what sounded like dates and numbers. Samuel had gone pale when she mentioned it, had locked himself in his study for hours. When he emerged, he announced they were taking Abigail to the hospital immediately, claiming the fever was too dangerous to manage at home. But Catherine suspected the real reason. Samuel was terrified of what his daughter might reveal about him. Margaret asked what secrets Samuel might be hiding. Catherine shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She did not know. Her husband had grown distant over the past year, spending long hours away from home, returning with unexplained sums of money that he claimed came from investments. He had become obsessed with newspapers, reading every article about deaths and disappearances with an intensity that frightened her. And lately, he had begun visiting Abigail at the hospital at odd hours, times when he thought Catherine would not notice, sitting beside their daughter's bed, and whispering things Catherine could not hear. The social worker made detailed notes of everything Catherine revealed. After the distressed mother left, Margaret sat alone in her office and considered what to do with this information. Dr. Hartley needed to know that the nocturnal speaking had been occurring for months before hospitalization, that predictions had already proven accurate, that Samuel Brennan was behaving suspiciously. But she also understood the deeper implication. If Abigail had spoken about her own father 3 days before being brought to the hospital, and if the pattern held true, then Samuel Brennan had approximately 27 days left to live. Unless whatever was speaking through his daughter had already marked him for death weeks ago, in which case his time might be even shorter. Dr. Hartley received Margaret Dunlap's report the following morning and immediately convened an emergency meeting with Father O'Reilly. The priest arrived within the hour, and together they reviewed the disturbing timeline Catherine Brennan had provided. But it was O'Reilly who first voiced the pattern that both men had been reluctant to acknowledge. He had been conducting his own investigation, quietly following up on the names Abigail had spoken during her nocturnal episodes. Thomas Pritchard, dead of heart seizure 4 days after being named. Jonathan Eldridge, the hospital board member accused of embezzlement, found dead in his study 11 days after Abigail exposed his theft. The official cause was recorded as suicide by laudanum overdose, though the timing struck O'Reilly as suspiciously convenient. Horace Manning, the corrupt judge, had fallen down the stairs of his own home 16 days after his crimes were revealed in Latin. He broke his neck, dying instantly. The deaths were being treated as unrelated tragedies, natural accidents, the ordinary misfortunes that befell men in a dangerous world. But O'Reilly had found something else, something that transformed coincidence into unmistakable pattern. He had spent hours in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, searching through old records for any mention of similar phenomena. What he discovered was a name that appeared repeatedly in documents from the late 1870s. Constance Pritchard. She had lived on Arch Street, in the very house the Brennan family now occupied. She had been known in certain circles as a medium, a woman who claimed communion with the dead and knowledge of hidden things. The records described how Constance would fall into trances and speak revelations, how people came to her seeking truth about missing loved ones or lost inheritances. But the documents also contained warnings. Several accounts mentioned that those whose secrets Constance revealed often met untimely ends. A man exposed for fraud drowned in the Schuylkill River. A woman whose adultery she spoke of died from contaminated medicine. The pattern repeated across 3 years until Constance herself died in April of 1879. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but O'Reilly had found her obituary. She was only 34 years old. More troubling still, O'Reilly had discovered Constance's journals, donated to the Historical Society by a distant cousin who wanted nothing to do with them. The priest had spent 2 sleepless nights reading through page after page of careful documentation. Constance described her ability as both gift and curse, explaining how she had discovered a method to become what she called a vessel for unspoken truths. She wrote of rituals and preparations, of opening channels between the living world and something else, something that listened and judged and demanded payment for every secret revealed. The final entries in her journal grew increasingly desperate. Constance wrote that she could no longer control what came through her, that the entity using her voice had developed hunger beyond her understanding. It did not merely reveal secrets anymore. It punished those secrets, marked the guilty for death, collected souls as payment for truth. She tried to stop, tried to close the channel she had opened, but found herself unable. The last entry, dated April 5th, 1879, contained only a single paragraph. She had spoken her own deepest secret during a trance, revealing a crime she herself had committed years before. She knew what would follow. She wrote that she had perhaps 3 days remaining before the price came due. Hartley felt ice settle in his stomach as O'Reilly finished explaining. Samuel Brennan had moved his family into that house. Samuel, whom Catherine described as obsessed and secretive, who visited his daughter at strange hours, who had grown terrified when Abigail spoke his name. The doctor looked at the priest and asked the question that neither wanted to face. Had Samuel found Constance's journals? Had he understood what they described? And most horrifying of all, had he deliberately attempted to transfer this terrible ability to his own daughter? O'Reilly reached into his satchel and withdrew a leather-bound book, its cover worn and stained. He had taken one of Constance's journals from the archives, technically theft, but justified by urgency. He opened it to a marked page and showed Hartley the passage. Constance had written instructions for the ritual, detailed steps for opening a vessel. But she had also included a warning in capital letters, underlined 3 times. The channel must be closed properly, or it will consume the vessel and all who know the vessel's secrets. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Hartley asked if there were instructions for closing the channel. O'Reilly shook his head slowly. If such instructions existed, Constance had not written them down. Or perhaps she had, but those pages were missing. The journal showed signs of having been damaged, several sections torn out entirely. Someone had removed crucial information, and both men suspected they knew who. Samuel Brennan appeared at the hospital shortly after nightfall on April 2nd, arriving unannounced and demanding to see his daughter. The nurse on duty tried to explain that visiting hours had ended, but Samuel pushed past her with wild eyes and trembling hands. Dr. Hartley, who had been reviewing patient charts in his office, heard the commotion and arrived to find Samuel standing in the doorway of the children's ward, staring at Abigail's sleeping form with an expression that mixed desperation with something close to madness. Hartley guided Samuel firmly to a private consultation room, closing the door before speaking. The clerk's appearance had deteriorated since the last visit. His clothes hung loose, suggesting weight loss. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His fingers moved constantly, picking at his cuffs, adjusting his collar, never still. When Hartley asked what had brought him to the hospital at such an hour, Samuel's composure finally shattered. The confession poured out in broken sentences, words tumbling over each other in frantic confession. 6 months earlier, Samuel had discovered journals hidden behind a loose brick in the basement of their Arch Street house. The previous owner, a woman named Constance Pritchard, had left them there. He began reading out of simple curiosity, then fascination, then obsessive belief. The journals described abilities that defied natural law, methods to access knowledge that should remain hidden. Constance wrote about becoming a vessel for truth, about hearing the secrets that saturated the air around the living, the confessions that souls carried like burdens. Samuel admitted what Hartley and O'Reilly had already suspected. He had performed the ritual described in those journals, using Abigail as the vessel. He rationalized it to himself as a gift, a way to give his daughter extraordinary capabilities. He convinced himself that the warnings in the journals were exaggerations, that Constance had simply failed to control what she had accessed. He believed he could do better, could open the channel more carefully. So on the night of December 6th, 1880, he followed the instructions exactly. He prepared the ceremonial elements, spoke the required phrases, and bound his daughter to something that existed between the known world and whatever lay beyond. The transformation was not immediate. For 3 days, Nothing seemed different. Then Abigail woke at 2:47 in the morning and began speaking Latin she had never learned, revealing truths she could not possibly know. Samuel was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. He had proven that Constance's methods were real, but he quickly realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The ritual was incomplete. He had followed the instructions for opening the vessel, but discovered too late that the crucial pages describing how to close it properly had been torn from the journal. Samuel described his growing panic as the predictions began coming true, as people Abigail named started dying in mysterious circumstances. He tried to find the missing pages, tore apart every inch of that basement searching for additional journals or loose papers. He found nothing. He attempted to reverse the ritual himself, speaking the opening phrases backward, trying variations. Nothing worked. Abigail remained silent during the day and spoke devastating truths, each night at precisely the same hour. The channel stayed open, and whatever used his daughter's voice showed no sign of releasing her. Then, 3 days before he brought Abigail to the hospital, she spoke about him. Samuel understood enough Latin to recognize his own name, to catch fragments about his work at the customs house. He had been taking bribes for 2 years, allowing certain merchants to avoid duties and inspections in exchange for substantial payments. It was theft from the government, fraud on a significant scale. If discovered, he would face prison. But worse than the exposure of his crimes was the realization of what it meant. He had been marked. Just like all the others whose secrets Abigail revealed, he was now counted among those who would pay the price. Hartley listened to this confession with mounting horror. He asked Samuel why he had come to the hospital tonight, and the clerk pulled a crumpled newspaper from his coat pocket. The article described the death of a customs official named Vincent Shaw, who had been found dead in his office 3 days prior. Shaw had been Samuel's superior, the man who had first approached him about the bribery scheme. Shaw's death was being investigated as possible murder. Samuel knew what this meant. The pattern was accelerating. People connected to the secrets Abigail revealed were dying faster now, as if whatever force operated through her was growing stronger, more efficient in its collection of souls. Samuel grabbed Hartley's arm with desperate strength. He begged the doctor to help him, to find some way to stop what he had started. He would confess his crimes publicly, face whatever legal consequences followed, if it meant protecting his daughter from this curse he had inflicted upon her. But even as he spoke, Hartley recognized the futility of such promises. The channel was open. The entity had tasted truth and blood, and based on everything they had learned from Constance's fate, Samuel Brennan had perhaps days left before the price of his own revealed secrets came due in full. Father O'Reilly spent the next 3 days in near constant study of Constance Pritchard's remaining journals, searching for any clue that might reveal how to close the channel Samuel had opened. He consulted texts on medieval mysticism, corresponded with scholars at other Jesuit institutions, and prayed with an intensity that left him exhausted. The answer, when he finally found it, was not hidden in complex theology or obscure ritual. It was stated plainly in one of Constance's earlier entries, written before fear had consumed her documentation. The method was simple in concept, but devastating in practice. To close a vessel, the person who had opened the channel must have their deepest secrets spoken by the vessel itself, and then they must accept the consequence willingly. The entity that judged and collected demanded this final payment, the ultimate price for having disturbed the boundary between hidden truths and revealed knowledge. Constance had written that she'd discovered this requirement too late, after she had already opened herself as vessel. When she finally understood what closing would cost, she attempted to live with the channel open rather than face the payment. That decision had only prolonged her suffering. O'Reilly brought this information to Dr. Hartley on the evening of April 5th. Together, they made the difficult decision to share it with Samuel Brennan. The clerk arrived at the hospital within an hour of receiving their message, his face haggard but determined. When O'Reilly explained what would be required, Samuel listened in silence. The priest made certain there was no misunderstanding. If Samuel allowed Abigail to speak his secret during one of her nocturnal episodes, if he accepted the consequence rather than fleeing from it, the channel would close. Abigail would be freed from this terrible burden. But Samuel himself would die, likely within minutes of the confession being spoken aloud. Samuel asked only one question. Would Abigail remember what she had revealed during these months? Would she carry the weight of all those secrets, all those deaths, for the rest of her life? O'Reilly consulted his notes from Constance's journals. The woman had written that vessels retained no conscious memory of what they spoke during episodes. The knowledge passed through them without taking root in their own minds. If the channel closed properly, Abigail would wake with no recollection of the Latin or the truths or the people she had marked for death. The decision Samuel faced was impossible. Accept certain death to save his daughter from continuing as a vessel, or remain silent and hope for some other solution, while knowing that his own revealed secrets would likely kill him anyway, within days. He sat in the hospital chapel for 2 hours, and when he emerged, his face carried the calm of someone who had made peace with the inevitable. He told Hartley and O'Reilly that he would do what was necessary. He would sit beside Abigail's bed that night and wait for 247 to arrive. When she began speaking, if she spoke of him, he would confess everything aloud and accept whatever followed. Catherine Brennan was not told of this plan. Samuel insisted on sparing her the agony of waiting for his death, of watching it happen. He visited her at home that afternoon, held her for a long time without explanation, kissed his son James, and told them both that he loved them more than words could express. Catherine sensed something final in his goodbye, but did not understand its full meaning until much later. That night, Samuel positioned himself in a chair beside Abigail's hospital bed. Dr. Hartley sat across from him, and Father O'Reilly stood near the window with rosary beads moving through his fingers. The clock ticked through the late evening hours, through midnight, through the deep darkness before dawn. None of the men spoke. They simply waited for the appointed time when truth would demand its final price. At 2:47, Abigail's eyes opened. Samuel leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. The Latin began, and within the first few sentences, all 3 men heard Samuel's name spoken. O'Reilly translated in a whisper as Abigail revealed the full scope of her father's crimes, the bribes he had taken, the merchants he had protected, the government revenue he had stolen through deliberate negligence. The amounts were precise, the dates exact, the evidence damning beyond any possibility of defense. When Abigail paused in her recitation, Samuel began to speak. His voice shook but did not break. He confessed everything aloud, adding details even the nocturnal Latin had not included. He explained his motivations, his rationalizations, his growing desperation as the debts mounted and the payments became necessary. He admitted that he had known it was wrong, had felt guilt with each transaction, but had continued anyway, because stopping would have meant exposure and ruin. And then he said the words that mattered most. He accepted responsibility. He accepted the consequence. He was ready to pay the price. Abigail spoke one final sentence in Latin, O'Reilly's translation came in barely a whisper. "The vessel is sealed. The debt is collected." Then the girl fell silent and lay back down into what appeared to be natural sleep. Samuel Brennan stood from his chair, took 3 steps toward the window, and collapsed. Dr. Hartley was beside him instantly, checking for vital signs, but he knew before his fingers found the absent pulse that Samuel was gone. The death was instant and inexplicable, a heart that simply stopped beating with no warning or natural cause. The time was exactly 2:54 in the morning on April 6, 1881. Philadelphia Police Detective Robert Sinclair arrived at the hospital at dawn, summoned by Dr. Hartley's urgent message about a death that defied medical explanation. The physician provided only the most basic facts. Samuel Brennan had died suddenly during a visit with his hospitalized daughter. No apparent cause, no signs of violence or poisoning. Sinclair examined the body and found nothing suspicious in the conventional sense. A man's heart had simply stopped. But something about the circumstances troubled him enough to request permission to search the Brennan home on Arch Street. Catherine Brennan, devastated by news of her husband's death and barely able to comprehend what had happened, gave her consent. Sinclair arrived at the house with 2 officers and began a methodical examination of the premises. He found the basement journals within the first hour, hidden poorly behind loose bricks where Samuel had repeatedly removed and replaced them. The detective read through page after page of Constance Pritchard's careful documentation, his expression growing, increasingly grim as he absorbed the content. But it was what else Sinclair discovered that transformed the investigation from mysterious death into documented abuse. Tucked between the pages of one journal were Samuel's own notes, detailed records of what he had done to his daughter over the course of months. He had documented the ritual with clinical precision, noting dates, times, and observed effects. He described how he forced Abigail to memorize passages, how he deprived her of sleep to make her more susceptible, how he performed the ceremonial elements while she was in a state of exhausted semi-consciousness. The notes revealed systematic psychological conditioning designed to break down Abigail's resistance and make her mind receptive to whatever the ritual was meant to accomplish. Samuel had recorded his methods with the detachment of an experimenter documenting a scientific procedure, showing no awareness of the cruelty he was inflicting on his own child. The final entries grew increasingly panicked as he realized the ritual had worked in ways he could not control, that he had opened something he could not close, that his daughter was being consumed by forces he did not understand. Sinclair also found correspondence between Samuel and several corrupt customs officials, documentation of the bribery scheme that matched exactly what Abigail had revealed in her nocturnal Latin. The amounts, the names, the dates, all confirmed through Samuel's own careful record-keeping. It appeared the man had been unable to stop himself from documenting everything, perhaps driven by guilt, to create evidence of his own crimes. Medical examiners reviewed the case and concluded that Abigail's condition was entirely the result of trauma inflicted by her father. The nocturnal speaking episodes were classified as a severe dissociative response, her mind fragmenting under the weight of forced memorization and psychological abuse. The Latin phrases she recited were determined to be passages Samuel had made her learn through repetition, though how she had acquired knowledge about specific people and events remained unexplained in the official reports. The timing of 2:47 each morning corresponded precisely to when Samuel typically began his nightly sessions with the journals and ritualistic procedures. The conclusions drawn by Philadelphia authorities were neat and rational, fitting uncomfortable supernatural elements into boxes labeled trauma and coincidence. They acknowledged the abuse, documented the psychological damage, and closed the investigation with Samuel Brennan's death, eliminating any possibility of criminal prosecution. What they could not explain, and chose not to pursue, was how a 9-year-old girl could have known such specific, verifiable truths about people she had never met, or why everyone whose secrets she revealed ended up dead within weeks. Some mysteries were better left unexamined by men who preferred the world to make sense, according to natural law. Treatment under Dr. Hartley's direct supervision began the morning after Samuel Brennan's death. Abigail woke at her usual hour, and for the first time in weeks, she attempted to speak during daylight. The words came haltingly at first, her voice rusty from disuse, but they came. She asked for her mother. She asked what day it was. She asked why she was in a hospital. When Catherine arrived and told her gently that her father had passed away, Abigail wept with genuine grief, showing no awareness that she had been present when he died, no memory of the Latin confession that had preceded his final moments. Dr. Hartley documented her recovery with meticulous care. Her ability to speak during waking hours returned gradually over the course of 2 weeks. She showed no signs of the knowledge she had revealed during her nocturnal episodes. When asked about Latin, she said she had never studied it. When shown written passages in that language, she could not read them. Medical students and visiting physicians examined her as an unusual case of selective mutism resolved through time and proper care. None of them were told about the nights when she spoke impossible truths. The nocturnal episodes did continue for several more weeks, though their character changed after Samuel's death. Abigail would still sit up at 2:47, but instead of revealing secrets, she spoke only fragments, incomplete phrases that Father O'Reilly identified as prayers and blessings in archaic Latin. It was as if whatever had used her voice was slowly withdrawing, leaving behind only echoes of its presence. By late May, the episodes had decreased to once every few nights. By June, they stopped entirely. Abigail slept through the night peacefully, and when she woke, she remembered nothing of the darkness that had spoken through her. Catherine Brennan made the decision to leave Philadelphia in July of 1881. Her sister had a home in Pittsburgh, far enough from the memories and the whispers that had begun circulating about the strange case of the mute girl who spoke prophecies. Catherine sold the house on Arch Street quickly, at a loss, to a buyer who knew nothing of its history. She took her children and what belongings they could carry, leaving behind the city where her husband had died, and her daughter had been used as a vessel for truths too terrible to bear. The case was documented extensively in medical literature over the following years. Dr. Hartley published a paper in 1883 titled Selective Mutism and Nocturnal Vocalization, a case study in childhood trauma response. The paper made no mention of accurate predictions or revealed secrets, focusing instead on the psychological mechanisms that might cause a child to compartmentalize speech into waking and sleeping states. It was cited in several subsequent studies and contributed to Hartley's growing reputation as an authority on childhood neurological disorders. Father O'Reilly never published his findings. He kept Constance Pritchard's journals locked in a private safe at St. Joseph's Church, along with his detailed translations of everything Abigail had spoken during her time at the hospital. Before his death in 1906, he left instructions that the documents be sealed for 100 years, with a note explaining that some knowledge was too dangerous to circulate while anyone connected to the case might still be living. The journals remain in the church archives, waiting for their appointed opening date. Abigail Brennan lived a quiet life in Pittsburgh, working as a teacher and marrying a shopkeeper named Harold Finch in 1902. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Those who knew her described a woman of gentle temperament, who never spoke about her childhood in Philadelphia, who deflected questions about her family history with polite vagueness. She died in 1954 at the age of 82, having lived 6 decades beyond the terrible spring when something had used her voice to expose the hidden sins of the living. Medical records indicate that in all those years, she never spoke Latin again, never showed any sign of the knowledge she had once revealed. Whatever channel Samuel Brennan had opened in his daughter closed permanently the night he accepted the consequence of his actions. Whether the entity that had judged and collected had been satisfied with his sacrifice, or whether it simply moved on to find other vessels, remains unknown. What is certain is that Abigail Brennan carried no conscious memory of what it felt like to be a conduit for truths that should have remained buried, to be the voice through which the guilty were marked for death. If you've made it this far, you deserve to know the truth about more stories like this. Click that like button right now because tomorrow, I'm dropping a case that makes this one look tame. A story about a boy who drew maps of places that didn't exist yet, and when those places appeared years later, everyone who saw his drawings wished they hadn't. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. The past has more secrets than you can imagine, and we're just getting started.